Good day. My name is Warren Harper. I am known as Bala. I am an audio engineer and a musician. Popular music. Black popular music. Uh, well, it's been the name of a genre, which was the music that made it to a certain place in popularity in media, which at the time was mostly radio. And so they called certain music pop. That was the commercialized, very processed music that whoever was trying to push to the masses was able to do so with. It wasn't all necessarily the same thing or even the same real genre of music. There was a time when jazz was the popular music. It was the dance music of the day. There was a time when, and there are still places where blues is the prominent music, and therefore the pop of that area. So pop is really, to me, regional. And much more specific than somebody outside of whoever's doing the listening, making that list, deciding what is popular and what is not. Those who do the programming for the radio, for television, for movies, for such. And some of them go looking for new talent, some of them don't. Some of them have things written, but that's more expensive now, so some of them don't. Black popular music to me is the music that we make popular. Most often made by us and for us, black folk, that is. That term in itself can be a sticky situation, but I identify that way. I'm of African American history, and I'm thinking that African American music as a whole covers all genres. I mean, all of it comes from the blues anyway, and much of the blues was us. So, what is popular music? Popular music is, in whatever region you're in, the music that is most popular, played most, or listened to most, by choice, by people. Black popular music, it would be black people. When I say made for us, made by us, when I say made by us, we're speaking of our own experience. We're writing from what we know. We're expressing who we are, as we are, and how we are through music. Not all music is reflective of all of us. We are all different and varied, just like the world. However, our experience translates through our music. The feelings we have that can be amplified, channeled, changed, or not influenced at all by the music around us. I don't know much about music therapy, but I know it's very effective. The musicians that I know that practice it and use it in their writing affect audiences very strongly with seemingly simple pieces of music, sometimes very complex pieces of music. But again, that's relating vibrations from us through our collective instruments, voices, percussion, whatever it is, to get a feeling across, get a message across, or have a purpose. Music without purpose to me is, well, in this time and age, it seems very popular. But it's not something I want to spend a lot of time on. So, music does have a purpose. And I think that we've been taught to forget that if we're not musically educated. I want to tell you guys a story about how I got started in this business. My mom still tells this story. She says that the year that I was conceived, which was 1968, during a blackout, whole another story, they had tickets to a bunch of shows, and they happened to have orchestra section seats. And so they went, pregnant with me. My mother said every time the timpani went off, I went off in the womb. She knew I was going to be a drummer and didn't want to admit it. It took her a lot of years to get to that point, to admit it. But the radio was very vibrant in the 1970s and 1980s when I was coming up, and very influenced by music around me. My parents and grandparents had records, albums, big 14-inch discs, played on turntables that they had everything. They had comedy, they had all kinds of music, a lot of doo-wop, a lot of jazz, a lot of the original R&B stuff. I'm talking Smokey Robinson and uh, the Dells, all the way up through the Dells and such, that era of music, Marvin Gaye, and just incredible music that was really well recorded, really well mixed, and released in a way that was an experience, especially when you put on headphones. I miss that. When in high school, albums switched to, actually it was middle school, switched to cassettes, the headphones that came out were terrible. I mean, terrible. The original earbud things that Realistic, which was a branch of Radio Shack, which probably doesn't even exist anymore, they sounded fine until you turned them up past about 3. And these things went to 10. They would distort, the bottom would get all flatulent. It was terrible. So I learned to equalize my albums in a way that I could get a decent sound out of those headphones at a slightly higher volume, recording the albums to cassettes. And then CDs came when I was in high school, and it was like, okay, this sounds, for lack of a better word, digital, but it doesn't mean the same thing anymore. It sounded harsh and pinchy and I don't know, like it had been run through some kind of filter that we couldn't really understand. It was clear enough, you could tell what the song was, but it just wasn't warm and rich like albums. So as that happened, I started learning about doing sound for high school plays without microphones, just running music and sound cues. Built speakers in high school, and then went on to Atlanta and dropped out of college and started learning to play drums from these guys and started learning how to do sound. And then 10 years later I went to sound school, and graduation from that was the year 2000, so that's 22 years ago now. But I've been mixing for 10 years before that. So my big love of music started with my parents, I think, and my grandparents, and the radio. I skipped a few steps in there. I should have started talking about mono recordings, just one microphone in a room, making a record, a document of whatever performance was happening. It was called documenting performances. It wasn't meant for entertainment purposes originally, the way they started documenting these jazz performances and other performances even before that. But when radio came along, all of a sudden you had all of these documents, records of these performances, and they started playing them on the radio. So now, what becomes popular can change based on radio, as I was saying before. However, as far as looking at, I got lost. I stopped. Hold on. I lost my thought.
The production?
Yes. Radio came about. So radio made us as sound engineers, made us reach for a better, more complete sound. So then, all of a sudden, there are 2 microphones recording. So now you're getting one closer to the vocalist and one closer to the band, so you can kind of balance that and get it different. Then you have the advent of stereo and multi-tracking, so you now have more than 2 microphones, and you can put a microphone on each thing, get an input for each thing. So now with these large recordings, you're recording on 2-inch tape. And there are these giant machines that have to be calibrated a certain way to make them work right. But, for example, Curtis Mayfield, this could not have been done many, many years before that, but recorded many tracks on a tape in New York, sent that tape to other cities to get recordings from other musicians added to this specific record. I believe it's the album Curtis that I'm talking about, but I don't remember the history of it well enough to quote it exactly. But apparently this tape went around to many studios in many cities, and when it got back to New York, the complete song was there, and all these musicians had added their pieces and made it work. I have since seen live recordings on YouTube, actually, of these same songs done, and you can see how many people are actually in this group and hear that all these parts are on the albums. It's pretty amazing to think that back then, in the 70s, you could send a tape from California to New York, get somebody to record something on it with the tracks that you've already done, and then send it back. And you've got their part. They didn't have to travel to California. It's a lot cheaper to mail the tape back and forth, or at least it was. So Then you have the advent of digital recording, digital multi-tracking, digital editing. No more cutting tape. You can edit just one of 24 tracks and make it do what you want, manipulate it how you need it in relation to all the other tracks without touching anything else. This was brand new. You couldn't do that cutting tape unless you had just one thing on that tape. So now you have the ability to digitally move things around like word processing for audio pieces. And it's pretty incredible what can be done with editing and all the rest of this. And the advent of all these processing has gotten better and better and better, but also has gotten more and more and more, kind of like cable TV. You get a few better channels, but then you get 100 channels you won't watch. Okay, there's 100 plugins you won't use. And if you're like me, you'll use minimal plugins. You'll try to get the right sound on the way in to whatever recording medium you're recording in. But this has changed so much because now people email songs back and forth. Oh yeah, go ahead and add your guitar to this and send it back. And people do it. I've done it. It makes perfect sense. In fact, your professor had me do some drum tracks on a couple of songs, and it was done via email. It was great, and it's so easy. Digital sound has gotten a lot better too. It's much richer now and can be processed much better now too. All of that came up with the multi-tracking and such. Movie industry did a lot for changing this. The news industry as well. I live in Washington D.C. Originally from New York, and this area has an incredible music scene. I started off when I first moved here in 1994. I played drums for a band called Sacred. Actually, we were called Circle of Fire at that time, and I started going to jam sessions and playing more. Before I moved here, I was in Atlanta and was hanging out with a lot of musicians, and I wasn't good enough to play with them, and they already were established bands that had drummers. So they basically said, oh, okay, run the monitor rig at the rehearsal space. And that's kind of how I started learning how to do live sound, learning how to keep feedback down and that kind of thing. I didn't really know that much about what I was doing. Just figured out equalizers and gain, that was it. And it got me somewhere. I started wanting to do it for a living. And when I moved to D.C., it was a guy named Matt Rowe became my sound mentor, working in a small club called Asylum, and we had 6 punk bands a night, half-hour sets, 10-minute changeovers, and you actually had to step down one step to get on the stage. It was pretty crazy, and everybody wanted to be loud, really, really loud. So you had to learn to push things, what not to push. You had to learn what frequencies to cut in order to keep things clear. And Matt was a really good teacher. We're at Sound of the City Studios. I am the engineer for this facility. It's a very small kind of mom and pop shop spot. Not a lot of big expensive gear, but we get a really full, rich, beautiful sound in this room. This is just the control room. There's a bigger room in there where we have, all the instruments set up and such. I was talking about flying tracks back and forth. Well, because of that, I get to see and hear a lot of music that's been made that way, especially since lockdowns have been over for a minute now, but things are still just picking up. The big shows have just started again, the big tours. So in my industry, that's big, because when the big ones are going, the small ones can happen. But the small ones only do so much for us. We need the big work too, or a steady place of employment. So I see a lot of musicians. In my time, 1994 until 2022, here in DC, I've seen a lot of musicians. I've gotten to know a bunch of musicians, and I've gotten really cool with a lot of musicians. There are a lot of great people here, musicians or not, a lot of great people in DC that are from DC in this area, the DMV. The majority of folks that I see that are serious about the craft here, the vast majority, can come together, link up, and do a show. Rehearsal or not, depending. I've seen many groups be the local group to back up a larger artist who doesn't want to travel with a band, for example, but needs a band to do the live show. One of the owners of this space is a producer and a drummer percussionist who plays with many, many people and has for many, many years. So he's got a sort of a team of people that he knows that are all multi-instrumentalist producers. For an example, these guys come together on a Tuesday night out of the blue, not having seen each other in a good while, don't rehearse anything. Somebody will talk about an idea for 1 minute, I'll hit record, and they'll play it, and then they'll just say, "Oh, just keep it going," and they'll talk about a song for less than a minute, and then play, and then do it again, and play something else, and do it again, and play something else. I've recorded for 2 hours and gotten 18, 20 tracks out of that, and at least half of them are usable. And a lot of them are like, can really be developed into something great. And this is just the guys coming together. So I get to see this kind of thing, and these guys play with projects all over the world now because they've been playing long enough, they've gotten known enough. DC should be known better for its good musicians because there are a lot of them here. Same with Maryland and Virginia. This whole DMV area. There are a bunch of good music schools, a couple of good music high schools here in DC, music camps all over the place, and lots of these people that I've just mentioned and the musicians that come through here also teach, both privately and in schools. DC is a very specific region, and it's wonderful because it has its official music now, which is native to DC, and that's go-go. The godfather of go-go being Chuck Brown. There are many, many famous go-go groups. You guys may know the song, or you may know some of the songs once you hear them. Some have been in movies. Go-go has reached beyond the DMV area. In fact, made it to Europe. I know some of these big go-go bands tour there now, which is great. But that is the regional music of DC. It's DC's own funk. And it is the popular music of DC, so that is most definitely pop. I see a lot of jazz here. I see a lot of I want to call it rap music. Calling it all hip-hop to me is like calling tissue Kleenex or all hot tubs jacuzzis. Because I came up in New York when it started. I remember the beginnings of hip-hop. And I just met Wonder Mike, who sang the original term hip-hop in the first rap to ever go gold, which was called Rapper's Delight by Sugar Hill Gang. Yeah, a new genre of music started in New York at that time. Hip-hop, what became hip-hop, rap music. Started up very, very close to that time on the West Coast as well. And that became the popular musics of those times. So hip-hop was pop before it was even recognized as a genre, because it's regional. And so when the national people try to make genres, it doesn't always apply the same. There are many bands who didn't fall into the genre specific markets that the record companies were pushing years ago. Fishbone is a great example of that, a West Coast band. They've been known as ska, alternative rock. And then there was a time when I wasn't into what was popular and I started exploring other music that had already been out. That's when I discovered jazz. And never went back. I love working in jazz, that's where I am now. But the drums I play are more reggae and funk. Not really playing that much now, just projects here and there for people. I guess I came into working in jazz later after I discovered it. I was very into rock and roll and reggae and funk and punk and that kind of stuff. Even go-go, being from New York, was kind of interesting. But jazz had a different thing, a different dynamic, a different richness, a higher education, it seemed, than a lot of the music I was listening to. I wasn't really into classical, although my parents are. There's some of it that I like very much. But I started working at a prominent jazz club in D.C. Just one night a week. And I was teaching school at the time, science and social studies, middle schoolers. It was a blast. That was a great job. When I left that to become production manager at this jazz club, and during that time I had to mix the 4-night runs, 3-night runs, depending of the major artists that came through. So I've gotten to mix so many names, I can't even name them all, but the ones I still travel with now are Kenny Garrett, one of the most incredible saxophone players ever. Another equally original and amazing drummer, Cindy Blackman Santana. I travel with her group as the sound engineer and drum tech. I've been out with Lisa Fisher and her band. Hoping you guys know these names. If not, please check them out. and worked with Monty Alexander, a prominent jazz pianist. These are four very different sorts of jazz. Cindy is a much more rock fusion. Monty goes everywhere, traditional, on through reggae. He does a lot of reggae with his groups, and has done a lot in his long career. All these people are older than me, have had longer careers than me. At least I think they're all older. I'm not sure about Cindy. And they've chosen me as the one they want to travel with, at least sometimes, and do this work because of the sound that I'm able to impart to the audience compared to what they're giving from the stage. And all I do is try to stay true to that. Turn it up a bit. So, how did I get to that? Working in this jazz club allowed me the opportunity to meet many, many greats in this industry, in the jazz industry. And I've tried hard to go on the road and work with them, and it worked. I'm still traveling with Kenny. I'm still traveling with Cindy. And I get to see the others at the club that I work at locally now, another jazz club, which is even more prominent than the first one. Because the owners like my sound and like what I can do to make artists comfortable on stage. Because if they're comfortable on stage, it's going to be a great show. I want to thank you, man, for having me here, Brother Quay. Thank you. So this studio, Sound of the City, so it's me and another drummer in here all the time. We like to take a moment sometimes, take an ear break, or work out our hands, or just do something else for a minute while we're in the middle of a project. You listen to a song too many times in a row trying to mix it and think about details and get little things right, and comparing compression and relative listening and all this crazy stuff that sound engineers have to do to get things right. So we got some toys in here. Drumming goes back to the beginnings of us. Aside from the voice, I believe it was the first instrument. Percussion, hitting things. There's something primally satisfying about hitting things, especially when you can do it in a way that makes some sense, creates a rhythm, does something fun for you, lets you get in a groove, a different thought, a different space, a meditation for a moment. It can be really good for recentering yourself. And so that's why these live over here, these bongos and ashiko drums that were, well, these old ashikos have been through it. But they make the sound that we want. And we can do what we do to help relax. My first teaching experiences, I was called in to do a career day as a sound engineer at the school I ended up teaching at. And one of the things that I said to these children was, find something you love and do that. Make that pay you for the rest of your life. I'm biased towards music or anything in the industry of entertainment, but especially live music side of things. So that's what I chose. But find your thing and do it with all your heart. Most people say if you're doing what you love, you never really work a day in your life.